"Don't come to the engagement party, Dad. You'll embarrass us." She didn't whisper it. She didn't even look away when she said it. My daughter stood in my kitchen. The kitchen I'd built with my own hands when she was 3 years old, where I'd made her oatmeal every morning until she left for university. And she said those words like she was telling me the weather. I didn't answer right away. I turned back to the sink and finished rinsing the coffee mug I'd been holding. My hands were steady. I don't know how. That was a Tuesday in late September. The leaves outside were just starting to turn, that first blush of orange along the maples on our street in Guelph. I remember noticing them through the window and thinking that autumn in Ontario always comes a little earlier than you expect. One day it's still summer. The next day, without any warning, everything starts letting go. I had retired 14 months before that Tuesday. 31 years as a civil engineer with the regional municipality. Roads, bridges, drainage systems, the invisible infrastructure that holds a town together. Quiet work, unglamorous, but I was good at it, and I knew I was good at it, and that had always been enough for me. My wife, Carolyn, had passed 4 years earlier. Ovarian cancer. We had 28 years together, and I would not trade a single difficult day of those 28 years for anything easier. After she was gone, my daughter became the center of my life, not in a smothering way. I tried hard not to be that father. But she was all I had left of the family we'd built, and I loved her completely. Her name is my daughter. That's how I'll say it here, because what happened between us doesn't need her name attached to it for anyone to understand. She was 26 when she met him, the man who had become her fiancé. His name was Spencer. His parents had old money from somewhere in the Westmount neighborhood of Montreal, the kind of money that doesn't announce itself but makes itself known in small, constant ways. The slight pause before they respond to a question they find beneath them. The way Spencer's mother, when she first came to my house in Guelph, looked at my living room like she was calculating what it would cost to redo it. I didn't dislike Spencer immediately. That would be too simple. He was charming in the way that men who've grown up expecting to be liked often are. Smooth, easy with compliments, always the right word at the right moment. My daughter glowed around him, and because she glowed, I tried to see what she saw. The engagement was announced at Christmas. He proposed at his parents' chalet in Mont-Tremblant. I know because my daughter sent me a photo of the ring and a text that said, "We're engaged. Spence proposed last night. The ring is 2.8 carats. Can you believe it?" I could believe it. What I couldn't quite believe was that she hadn't called, but I told myself that was just the excitement, that she'd been swept up in the moment. I called her the next morning and congratulated her, and asked when I could meet Spencer's parents properly, and she said, "Soon, Dad. We'll figure it out." We figured it out 3 months later. By then, they'd already started planning. The engagement party was to be held in May at a venue in the Plateau Mont Royal district of Montreal. Spencer's territory, Spencer's world. And the wedding itself, that September, would be at a historic estate outside Quebec City, 240 guests, a string quartet, a florist my daughter had found in a magazine. I want to be careful here, because I know how this sounds. I know it sounds like I was jealous of Spencer's world or threatened by it, or resentful of my daughter for wanting something grander than what I could offer. None of that is true. Carolyn and I had always wanted her to have a beautiful life. We'd saved for her university, helped her buy her first car, given her what we could without complaint or condition. What I didn't realize, at first, was how the math was being arranged. It started small. My daughter called me in February, just to chat, she said. We talked about her job. She worked in marketing in Montreal by then, and about the winter, and then she mentioned, almost in passing, that the florist deposit was due. $2,200. Spencer's parents were covering the venue and the catering, she said. She and Spencer were handling the honeymoon and the photographer, which left the flowers, the dress, and the rehearsal dinner. I could help with the flowers, I said, because that is what fathers do. Oh, Dad, really? That would be amazing. The dress came up 2 weeks later. She had found one at a boutique in Westmount. $4,600. I didn't even pause. I said I would take care of it, and I meant it. Carolyn would have wanted her to have a beautiful dress. That's what I told myself. That's what got me to yes before I'd even thought it through. By March, I had committed to the flowers, the dress, the rehearsal dinner, and after a phone call in which my daughter mentioned almost tearfully that the wedding coordinator they'd hired had suddenly raised her rate, half the coordinator's fee, all told, somewhere north of $12,000. I want to be clear, I had the money. I'd been careful my whole working life. I had a pension, savings. The house paid off. $12,000 was not going to ruin me. That was never the point. The point was what happened in late April. Spencer's mother, her name was Philippa, and she wore it like a title, invited my daughter and me to lunch at a restaurant in Montreal. I drove up from Guelph on a Friday, 4 hours each way. I wore my good blazer, the charcoal one Carolyn had bought me for our 25th anniversary. I had my hair cut the day before. We sat at a table near the window. Philippa ordered without looking at the menu. Spencer wasn't there. It was supposed to be a chance for the two of us to connect, my daughter had said. The lunch was civil. Philippa asked about my career with the kind of polite interest that makes it clear the answer doesn't matter. She mentioned their chalet twice, their place in the eastern townships once, and their upcoming trip to Tuscany in the same breath as asking how I was adjusting to retirement. Then my daughter excused herself to use the restroom, and Philippa leaned forward slightly and said, I do hope you understand that the guest list on your side will need to remain quite contained. The venue has an aesthetic, and we want to protect that. I looked at her. I'm sorry? The feel of the evening, she said, and smiled. We just want to make sure everything coheres. I nodded slowly. I didn't say what I was thinking. I thought about my brothers in Hamilton, my old colleagues, the neighbors who had brought food to my house for 2 weeks after Carolyn died. I thought about what it meant to be told those people might not cohere. I drove home that night and said nothing. May came. The engagement party. My daughter called me a week before to confirm I was coming, and I said of course. And then she was quiet for a moment, and then she said it. Don't come to the engagement party, Dad. You'll embarrass us. I asked her what she meant. She said Spencer's family would have a lot of people there. Colleagues, old family friends, people who ran in certain circles. She said she didn't want to have to explain my life to everyone. Didn't want people asking questions. She said she knew I'd had a good career, but it wasn't the kind of thing that translated, and she was worried I'd feel out of place and make things awkward. Make things awkward, I repeated. Dad, don't make this into something. I'm just trying to be honest with you. You can meet everyone properly at the wedding. There'll be more room for you there. I stood in my kitchen holding my phone, looking out at the maples. 3 days earlier I had wired $2,200 to the florist for flowers that would sit in a room I was not invited to enter. All right, I said. Thank you for understanding. I didn't understand, but I said, all right, and I hung up, and I stood there for a long time. That night I called my oldest friend, a man named Terrence, who'd worked roads with me for 20 years before moving to Barrie. I told him what my daughter had said. I didn't dramatize it. I just told him, and then I was quiet. Terrence said, What are you going to do? I said I didn't know yet. But that wasn't quite true. Something had clarified, there in my kitchen, in a way I hadn't expected. It wasn't anger, or not only anger. It was something more like a decision, the kind that settles into your chest quietly, without fanfare, and you know you're going to follow through on it because the alternative is to become someone you don't recognize. I am 63 years old. I spent 31 years making sure the infrastructure held. I buried my wife. I raised a daughter alone for the last 4 years of her childhood after Carolyn's first diagnosis, before the remission, before the return. I am not embarrassing. I am not a thing that needs to be hidden. She had asked me not to show up. I decided to take her at her word. The Monday after that phone call, I contacted the florist. I explained that there had been a change in the family arrangements and that I would be withdrawing my payment commitment. The deposit, the florist confirmed, was non-refundable, but the remaining installments, the larger portion, had not yet been processed. I said I understood, and I thanked her, and I asked her to remove my credit card from the file. The dress was more complicated. The boutique in Westmount had my daughter's measurements, and the gown was already being held. I had paid a deposit of $900, and the balance of $3,700 was due in 6 weeks. I called the boutique and spoke with the owner, a woman with a precise and careful voice, and explained that I would not be paying the balance. I asked what would happen to the gown. She said the gown would be released back to general inventory after a holding period. The deposit I'd paid would not be refunded. I said I understood. $900 was a reasonable price for what I was learning. The rehearsal dinner. I had made a reservation at a restaurant in Quebec City under my name and provided my credit card for the room booking. I called and canceled. There was no penalty. I was far enough outside the cancellation window. The coordinator's half fee I had already transferred. That one was gone. But the remaining installment, due in July, I simply didn't pay. I didn't call my daughter to tell her any of this. I didn't send a message. I went about my life, my morning walks along the Speed River Trail, my Wednesday curling league, a weekend trip to see my brother in Hamilton. I let the quiet do what quiet does. It took 3 weeks. She called on a Thursday evening, and I could hear it before she said a word, the particular texture of her breathing when she's been crying and is trying not to show it. Dad, the florist says they haven't received the final payment. And the boutique called me. They said the balance on my dress hasn't been paid and they're going to release it. Yes, I said. A silence. What do you mean, yes? I mean, yes, that's correct. I withdrew from those commitments. Why would you do that? Dad, the wedding is in 4 months. We're counting on. I told Spencer's parents that you were handling. You told me not to come to the engagement party, I said. You told me I'd embarrass you. I decided that if that's the case, perhaps my involvement in these arrangements doesn't make sense. Dad, you can't just. Those are 2 completely different things. Are they? She started to cry then. Real tears, not the strategic kind. I heard them, and they cost me something. I want to be honest about that. I am her father. It will always cost me something. I just needed the party to go smoothly, she said. Spencer's family is very particular, and I didn't want. It wasn't about you. It was about me, I said gently. You told me my life doesn't translate. You said you didn't want to explain me to people. I am not a burden to be managed, sweetheart. I am your father. She didn't say anything for a moment. We'll figure out the dress. Spencer's mother might. That sounds like a good plan, I said. We hung up. I sat in my armchair and looked at the room around me. The walls I'd painted the winter after Carolyn passed, because I needed something to do with my hands. The photos on the mantel. My daughter at 6, at 12, at her university graduation, standing between Carolyn and me with that enormous smile she'd had since she was an infant. The worn spot on the carpet by the window where Carolyn used to sit and read. I thought about what I was doing. I thought about whether I was being petty, and I decided I wasn't, and then I decided I wasn't sure, and then I decided it didn't matter as much as the alternative, which was to keep writing checks for a life that had no room for me in it. Philippa covered the dress. I found out later from Terence, who heard it from my daughter's aunt, who had been told in confidence and therefore told everyone that Philippa had done it with significant commentary about the unreliability of the father's side. My daughter had said nothing to defend me, or if she had, it hadn't made its way back to me. The rehearsal dinner was reassigned to a restaurant Spencer's parents knew in the old city. A grander room. A better wine list. Probably better for everyone, I thought. The wedding was September 14th. I had not been told definitively whether I was invited. There had been a stilted call in late June in which my daughter mentioned that of course I was walking her down the aisle, that she had never said otherwise, and I had said quietly that she had not included me in the timeline in any planning communication since May, and she had said that was because things had been complicated, and I had said I understood, and we had talked about other things until we ran out of them and said goodbye. I bought a suit. Navy, good wool, the kind you can wear to a funeral or a wedding or a retirement dinner, and no one can tell which one it was for. I booked a hotel room in Quebec City for 2 nights. I told Terence I would let him know how it went. On the morning of September 14th, I drove to the estate. It was a clear day, cold the way October pretends to be in mid-September, that particular Quebec light that makes everything look like a painting someone made up. The grounds were extraordinary. I will give them that. Stone walls, heritage gardens, a long alley of linden trees leading to the main house. I found my daughter in the bridal suite, where a woman who I understood to be the coordinator was adjusting her veil. My daughter looked up when I came in, and something moved across her face. Relief, I think, or something close to it. She dismissed the coordinator, and we were alone. She was beautiful. She has always been beautiful. She looked like Carolyn at certain angles, and it undid me for a moment, the way it sometimes does. "You came," she said. Of course I came. She stepped toward me and hugged me, and I held her the way I had when she was small and afraid of thunderstorms. Her hands were trembling slightly. "I'm sorry, Dad," she said into my shoulder. "I'm sorry for what I said in April. It was horrible, and it wasn't true, and I don't know why I said it. I didn't say it was all right because it wasn't entirely, not yet. But I said I loved her, and that was true, and it was the most important thing." We walked down that linden alley together, my daughter's hand tucked into my arm, her dress, Philippa's dress, as I privately thought of it now, sweeping the gravel path behind her. Spencer stood at the end of the aisle with the particular expression of a man who is trying very hard to look composed. His family occupied the front rows on the right side. My brothers, my daughter's aunt, 4 former colleagues, and the Nexians from next door, who had come uninvited and I was genuinely glad to see, sat on the left. We were not 240 people. We were not a string quartet. But we were there. The ceremony was brief and the vows were sincere, and I managed not to cry until the recessional, which I consider a reasonable personal achievement for a 63-year-old widower at his only daughter's wedding. At the reception, Philippa made her way to me during the cocktail hour. She was gracious in the way that people who've gotten most of what they wanted are sometimes gracious, expansive, a little condescending, but not unkind. She said my daughter was a lovely young woman. I agreed. She said Spencer was going to do everything he could to make her happy. I said I hoped that was true. Then she said, with that careful smile, "I understand there were some financial complications earlier in the process. I do hope everything worked out." I looked at her and I thought about 31 years of bridges that didn't fall down. I thought about Carolyn. I thought about my daughter's hand on my arm under those linden trees. "Everything worked out exactly as it needed to," I said. She nodded and moved on, and I went to find my brothers. Spencer came to me later, near the end of the evening. The formality had come off him by then. His tie was loosened. He'd had a few drinks, and he looked, for the first time, like a person rather than a presentation. He stood beside me at the edge of the dance floor, and we watched my daughter dancing with her aunt. "She talks about you a lot," he said. "The stuff you built. The bridges." I said that was good to hear. "I think she's proud of you," he said. "She doesn't always know how to show it, but I think she is." I didn't answer that. Some things you take on good faith and put away carefully, somewhere you can find them later when you need them. The night ended. My daughter hugged me at the door, her bouquet still in her hand, and she said, "I'll call you when we're back from Portugal." I said I'd answer. I drove back to my hotel through the dark Quebec countryside, past the river, past the farms with their lights still on. I thought about the flowers that hadn't been there, about the coordinator fee I'd never recovered, about the dress that bore someone else's name on the receipt. I thought about my daughter's face in the bridal suite, the tremble in her hands. I don't know if I handled everything perfectly. I'm 63, not 103. I have no business pretending to wisdom I haven't finished earning. Maybe I should have said more earlier. Maybe the right thing was a different kind of conversation, one where I sat across from my daughter and asked her plainly why she was ashamed of me, and listened to the answer, and we figured it out together before it came to any of this. But I also know this. There's a version of that spring in which I said nothing, paid everything, stood in the background of the photographs, and allowed her to believe that my dignity was something she could factor out of the equation whenever it was inconvenient. And I would not have been a better father in that version. I would only have been a quieter one. She called from Lisbon 9 days later. "Just to talk," she said. We talked for 40 minutes. She asked about my curling league. I asked about the food. She said the pastéis de nata were exactly as good as everyone claimed. I said I'd always wanted to go to Portugal. She said maybe we could go together sometime. Not this year, but sometime. I said it like that. And I meant it. I've thought a lot about that September, about what I did and didn't do, and whether I'd make the same choices again. The honest answer is mostly yes, not because I'm proud of every moment, but because I've lived long enough to understand that the way you respond to being dismissed says more about who you are than the dismissal itself ever could. What my daughter said to me in that kitchen, that I would embarrass her, that my life didn't translate. Those words came from somewhere. They didn't come from nowhere. She had spent 2 years inside a world that measured people by their postal codes and their wine lists and the schools their fathers attended. And somewhere in that time, she had started to see me through those borrowed eyes. That was her failure, yes, but I'd be dishonest if I didn't admit it was also, in some small way, a failure of mine. A failure to have more of those plain, direct conversations earlier, when these still would have cost us less. What I knew, standing at that sink, was that I couldn't pretend the words hadn't been said. Some people would have. Some fathers would have swallowed it, shown up anyway, smiled in every photograph, and told themselves that keeping the peace was the same thing as keeping their dignity. I used to think those men were wise. I don't anymore. I think they were just tired in a way that had hardened into habit. There's a kind of integrity that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't make speeches. It doesn't send long emails. It simply stops doing what it was doing, quietly, without drama, and waits to see what happens next. That's what I tried to do. I canceled those payments not to punish her, though I won't pretend there wasn't some of that in it, but because I genuinely could not keep funding a version of events that had no honest place for me in it. Continuing would have been a kind of lie, and I've told enough of those in my life to know they always cost more in the end than the truth would have. What I also know is that real intelligence, the kind that actually serves you over a lifetime, isn't about knowing the right people or reading a room correctly, or finding the perfect words in a difficult moment. It's about knowing what you stand for when it costs you something to stand there. My daughter is a sharp young woman. She always has been. But in those months, she confused social fluency for wisdom, and those are not the same thing. And the stubbornness it took to hold my position, to not call her and explain myself, to not soften the edges of what I'd done, that wasn't easy. I'm not someone who enjoys conflict. I spent 31 years in a career where you solve problems methodically, without ego, because the bridge either holds or it doesn't. But there are moments in a life where you have to let something be uncomfortable for long enough that the truth of it has a chance to land. That takes a particular kind of patience that isn't passive at all. It's one of the harder things I've done. Terrence asked me once, after all of it was over, whether I thought she'd really changed. I said I didn't know yet. I said I thought she was trying. I said that call from Lisbon, 40 minutes, asking about my curling league, laughing at something I said, felt like something real. Maybe it was. Maybe it takes getting the thing you thought you wanted without the person who loved you most to understand what was actually holding it together all along. I said I'd like to go to Portugal with her sometime. I meant it. I still mean it.